Book of the day is Black Trillium, and it is by 3 separate authors, each of whom has, or had when this was published in 1990, a very respectable career and a very solid following. So it's a combination of Marion Zimmer Bradley, though she's listed as Marion Bradley on this book, and Julian May and Andre Norton. Andre Norton is a long-term favourite author of mine whose books, I think, they've dated, but they've stood the test of time in terms of reading experience. Marion Zimmer Bradley, I've just started rereading, and I find her as difficult to deal with, I suppose, difficult is the word, as I did back in the day. And Julian May, I've read a few of hers, but certainly not recently, and I don't remember them very well. Anyway, Trillium was conceived apparently by a literature agent. This is from Wikipedia, by the way, you can check it for yourself. There was a German literature agent whose name I certainly can't pronounce, and in 1809 he devised the concept of 3 fantasy authors coming together to produce a novel with 3 different life stories, each written by a separate author. I bought this on speculation from old school sci-fi secondhand shop, which was closing, so I bought a lot of fantasy and sci-fi, and I thought this was a chance to go back to my roots, because fantasy, classic fantasy and classic sci-fi were where I really started as a reader, and I hadn't read this one. Apparently there are several. Wikipedia claims there are 5. There's certainly another one called Scarlet or Red Trillium that comes after this one. And in this one, all 3 authors write it. I think the rest of them, they sort of peel off on their own. I think Julian May writes a couple, and I think at least one of them happens a long time after this book. I feel no particular need to go on and read more. This book does the amazing thing that no book seem able to do anymore, of creating a full, complete and totally satisfying story within pages. I really enjoyed this book. It is old school fantasy, and if you like old school fantasy, you will enjoy it. It was published in 1990, and it feels like an early 90s book. It feels like fantasy, Dragonlance. It feels like you're going back to where modern fantasy was birthed, as it were. So it's a quest type book. There's 3 daughters born as triplets in a kingdom called Rwanda, which is described as a fairly pleasant, it's not idealized, but it's a pleasant country. It's sort of squashed in between other neighbors. It is largely a swampy country. It's ruled by humans, but there's a lot of other not human intelligent species that live in the country, and which are given their own land and their own autonomy, unlike their neighbouring country, which regards them as merely animals and wants to rape and plunder the resources of Rwanda. So we have a bit of a prelude to the actual story, which talks about how the white archmage who protects the whole land arrives for the princess's birth and names all 3 of them. Then we jump forward in time to when the neighbouring land of Labonok is about to invade. The king is kind of crazy, and he's very much under the sway of an evil magician called, I kid you not, Orogastus. I mean, I don't know who came up with that name. Perhaps it was the German publisher. But I think I just can't. Calling someone Orogastus is just funny, and there's so many things that you could say about it. I'm not going to. The 3 princesses are called the more pronounceable Haramis, and I never quite got the hang of all of these names. Kadia is the middle sister, and Anigel is the youngest. Apparently the three authors got together and each one of them wrote one of the characters and their quest to find a magic talisman that when combined can save their country from the invading Labanox. And I was expecting to find real differences in the writing style, because Andre Norton and Marion Bradley certainly have very different writing styles, and I didn't find it. This book felt like one single narrative. There wasn't a lot of noticeable differences in the writing style. I'm actually quite amazed and very impressed that three separate authors managed to create quite a thick book which actually holds together as an individual narrative as well as it does. It's not what I expected. I expected to be able to separate out which wrote which, and honestly, I've got no idea which one Andre Norton was. I'm leaning somewhat towards having written the oldest sister, Haramis, but I really can't be sure. Maybe Julian May can see a little bit of Annie the Gel. Not sure, and I couldn't see that anyone actually described who wrote what either. Now, I really enjoyed it. Like I said, it's sword and sorcery, it's quest, it's traveling through an invented land. The land, it doesn't provide you with maps, so you just have to go on the narrative to where they're traveling. There's a lot of swampy lands, there's high mountains with cold snow, there's all these different types of land through which the three princesses individually travel, and it's really enjoyable. The sword type thing comes from the fact that their country is smashed and conquered in the beginning. The sorcery comes from your archmage, so the evil sorcerer Orgastus and the white sorceress Bina, who are sort of opposing points, and both actually have a little bit of a combat over who's going to be the highest influence on the oldest of the three sisters. The travelling through the land and the Aborigines, or the non-human species, was interesting. Yeah, it was a bit like some of the Hero Quest novels. I loved it. What can I say? I'm struggling to describe it, because if you've ever read any Fantasy Quest, you will kind of know what this is. And that brings me to the fact that this book has been very heavily criticised, and it doesn't have good ratings on Goodreads. A lot of people haven't liked it at all. One person on Goodreads criticised it as saying this is the kind of thing that could only be popular in the early 90s. Dragonlance. It's like a Dragonlance novel, but not actually done by Dragonlance. Well, yes, it was published in 1990. You publish something in 1990, you're going to have a 1990s book. For its time, it was very popular. Fantasy was, quest was, sword and sorcery was very popular. Where this one really stands up, though, is not only in having three female authors, which was not all that common in the 90s still, but it's got three female characters. Each one of them has their own autonomy. The quest is theirs. They don't really have males, except their males exist as part of the story, but the primary characters and the primary events occur to three female, and I find them very distinct. I've read a number of reviews that claim that they can't tell them apart except by the colour of their hair. And I can only think that those people are very young, they don't know how to read fantasy very well, or possibly they're used to 6-second TikToks and don't have a long attention span. The three characters, I think, are very well described. Everyone seems to take something different away from the description of the three sisters, I've noticed. To me, Haramis is a scholar. She's described as someone who likes learning, deep thinking, and the fact that she goes more toward the sorcery side of the quest makes sense. She's also depicted as a strong character, though maybe perhaps a bit introverted, not especially interested in the mechanics of ruling, which tends to make for a bad ruler, in my opinion. But her quest is very individual and in some ways the most hazardous, because she encounters a sorcerer or Augustus who's trying to bring her under his influence. The second sister, Caddy, is a redhead. It's amazing how many people who've read this book interpret her as a warrior. I don't interpret her as a warrior at all. She comes to comes to me as a tomboy. She likes being outside. She liked hunting. She liked traveling in the marshes with her mentor. Warrior. I mean, she's more sword-like than the others, but I don't see her arc as being warrior. And in the end, she isn't claiming to be a warrior. What she wants to do is she wants to integrate the various non-human species in the land and bring them more into the mainstream, give them more personal autonomy, take them out from under the rule of humans. I don't see why more people don't see this as a positive. In this day and age, when so many First Nations people in so many countries around the world are fighting for autonomy, here in 1990, you had a female character in a fantasy novel who made that her goal, and I assume that comes forward in the next book. Red, Crimson, Trillium, Crimson, whatever. But very little credit seems to have been given to that by any of the people who've reviewed this book. Now, the third character, Anigel, she's the youngest, and she performs as a younger sister in the opening when each three is described. She likes court-type things. She likes gossip and dresses. She considers herself fearful, and both her and her sisters seem to think her least capable of fulfilling a hazardous quest on her own. Now, each one of these goes off and has their own quest, and we sort of jump from one to the other as their quest progresses, and more or less at the same time, though it varies a bit. Anigel, you would say, has the strongest character development because she turns from a soft princess to a really fierce and strong princess in the course of her travels. One of the criticisms that's been levied against this book quite frequently is that there's no character development. Again, did they even read this book? I'm not sure. They can't have gotten very far. We start off with very minimal descriptions of the princesses, their parents, and people in general. But the princesses' quest morphs their characters significantly. So yeah, another strange criticism. Compared, I suppose, to 9-volume epic fantasy quests of today, perhaps they don't have as much of... No, most fantasy quests of today have virtually no character evolution. This book has more character evolution than the last 3 trilogy fantasy quests of modern writing that I read. So, yeah, I don't know what they're on about. Okay, someone else said that there's nothing overall in this book that isn't completely expected or that doesn't check in a well-worn high fantasy trope. Well, you know where trope comes from? It comes from people doing it a lot. In the 1990s, it wasn't much of a trope because it was just starting. Remember, like, it was a few years ago. You might have forgotten that. Or maybe you just don't like reading a lot of the early stuff. This wouldn't be written today the way this was written. It'd probably be 17 novels for a start. Yes, so this is sort of a response to what other people say about it, but I don't... Some people thought the characters were deadly dull and that the landscape was boring. I can only assume that they don't have an imagination. This is a book that requires you to bring your own imagination to it. You need to read the book, and yes, it tells you what the swamp looks like, but you have to image it. It is not a book for a lazy reader, and it's not a book for someone who expects to 20 pages and to finish it soon. This took me a long time to read, and I was on a boat. There wasn't anything else to read. That was the only thing I took. Right, so the girls are successful in the end, both in finding their talismans, bringing the talismans under their control, combining them and saving their land. That's kind of obvious, but it's nice to have a book that ends the story arc at the last cover, instead of expecting you to buy an awful lot more before you find out what happened. Love that. 1990s did it well. 2020s are failing in that regard. As an interesting aside, the Black Trillium, as well as being this rather cool novel with this rather nice cover, is also a doom metal band. They're not bad. And their first single is called Banished, and featured Tim Charles from Neo Obliviscaris, a band I like a great deal and have seen live a number of times. So that just confirms something that my university librarian, she said. It's like anytime you quote, anytime you do a search online, you are bound to have a band named after whatever you are searching for. So, Black Trillium, heavily criticised. I think it's a great classic fantasy epic, well written, exceptionally well edited. You don't have three authors coming together to create such an integrated story without good editing. Many modern editors could learn from that, I feel. It won't be for everyone. Marion Zimmer Bradley has got her own sort of history that some people don't approve of. Anyone who isn't used to and doesn't enjoy reading epic fantasy from the 80s and 90s probably won't get into it that much, but I enjoyed it and I'm glad I read it. And I'm keeping it and I'm going to read it again. And some people just get an imagination.